This is Zudy Jasser sitting in for Seth and Chris today. They're away and have asked the doctor to be in the house while they're away. So it's great to be with all of you, and hope you're having a good Tuesday. And the United States took some time off yesterday to reflect on civil rights. And I want to spend some time talking to you about what is the state of civil rights, especially for American Muslims, and are they really the victims that a lot of the Islamists make them out to be? And I also want to catch you all up on what's happening in Iran. Unfortunately, the Trump derangement syndrome and obsession with Trump on most media had prevented Americans from really understanding and hearing about what's actually happening across the Middle East, and especially with the newest revolution since 2009 in Iran, and are things going any different? And a lot more to talk about, so whatever's on your mind, give me a call, 602-508-0960, 602-508-0960 on the Patriot. And so, yesterday it was a recognition of the courage and bravery of Martin Luther King Jr. and how he reminded us of what America stands for and what it means to be equal under the law. And, I'll tell you, as an American whose parents escaped persecution in Syria and came to a better place, a better country that gave us the freedom to be who we wanted to be and live that American dream, I always remember that we have rights here that we really don't have anywhere else in the world. And it's amazing, though. You read, I picked up Time magazine, and there it was, Nihad Awad from the Council on American Islamic Relations, lecturing Americans about, quote, the importance of intentional word usage and not to use defamatory code words. And there it was, his lens, and Time magazine giving him the inches of space to complain and whine about the status of American Muslims, and that we have to function together as a collective against the threat of anti-Muslim bigotry. And I read that saying, why does the left, why does the so-called mainstream media persist in forcing us Muslims to be forced into a pigeonhole of having our entire identity be done through the reflection of identity politics? And unfortunately, they lift up voices like Nihad Awad that quotes Martin Luther King Jr., I think, inappropriately, and says that Muslim civil rights are being infringed by the rest of America, when in fact, I think, and I think this is a good place to start with, is I think our biggest threat to our civil rights is within the Muslim community. Within the mosque is really where the battle for today's battle of the 60s, which was about black civil rights in the South and across America, trying to live up to what the American dream and what being American really meant. And as America started to head towards a more colorblind nation, I think inside the mosques in America, ask Muslim women that ask minority opinion holders in mosques if they have a voice. And as we look at the reasons for the threat upon national security, which I think, as I've talked to you before, has to do with the ideology of political Islam and Islamism, what is being done to counter the root causes? And unfortunately, the politics of identity have marginalized that. And this isn't just American Muslim groups like CARE and Nihad Awad and all the other identity politics that love to think of Islam as a race rather than a diverse ideology. Look at Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is a global media arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the Qatari nation state that is a font of Islamist evangelism globally. That, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood just this week, one of the news items also missed by the mainstream media, is the Muslim Brotherhood this week declared the United States an enemy state. So they basically, officially, the Brotherhood, by the way, which was running Egypt for over a year, and there's debate about, it's hard to believe there's debate, but there's debate about whether the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood should even be considered a terror group, which they are. Now we can talk, and we're going to have some guests today. I've invited Ryan Morrow from the Clarion Project, who will join us to talk about Iran and a few other things to get us caught up on some national security issues. And also later in the program, we're going to be joined by Shireen Kudosi, a Muslim reformer from America Matters. And there's been some updates just the past few days in the case against the physicians indicted by the, soon to be under trial for the federal crime of female genital mutilation. The first of its kind trial, and there's some updates there that unfortunately the national media is just not covering, but many of us on the front lines of these things are paying attention to it. Back to Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, this anti-American font of media, had on its front page yesterday quotations from Martin Luther King. And those quotations included, quote, "among the greatest lessons that Martin Luther King taught us can be applied today." And they quote him that injustice anywhere stops from justice happening anywhere. And, that quote that is so appropriately rendered to Martin Luther King Jr., they stole and said that somehow America needs to live up to that. And they also go on to quote other famous quotes from Martin Luther King, and I'm reading that going, these countries are bastions of tyranny, bastions of dictatorship, and yet they co-opt our recognition of a civil rights leader that brought America closer to the recognition of our own values, and somehow that becomes their story on their front page. And the Islamist groups in America will exploit that and use that to also lecture us. And fine. There's some improvements to happen. There is some bigotry that exists against Muslims in America, but what's the best way to address that? How do we treat that? And I think ultimately we can't be hypocrites. We need to recognize, Americans need to see Muslims as leading the battle for reform, leading the battle for modernity. And I think ultimately we need to address and prioritize our real civil rights issues. And inside the mosques, where women are at the back of the mosque behind curtains, the misogyny, the treatment of those who make decisions that some may disagree with. Is there real celebration of diversity within Muslim communities in America? And why is that important? I think it's important because those not only tolerations but reforms towards the 21st century will then translate into decreased radicalization, because radicalization, when they say, oh, I don't know how this guy was radicalized, it comes from intolerant speech. There have been 4, and this is, by the way, finally, the mainstream media last week reported on Newsweek, there was a story about 4 recent sermons that have been televised from North Carolina to New Jersey to California, sermons from the pulpits of mosques that basically called for the annihilation of Jews, cited Islamic scripture. And in my podcast, Reform This, I talk about, last week I talked about that citation from the hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the hadith, which many of us reformers don't believe is legitimate, but that one hadith does and has been quoted by many of the anti-Semites, and most recently was videotaped on December 8th, the day after President Trump identified Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which Israel has long identified as its own capital. And that simple identification, which has long been a part of every presidential campaign that I know of, now we finally had a president that acknowledged that during his presidency, not only during his campaign or her campaign. And unfortunately, that acknowledgement led to an outpouring of basically the bowels of Islamic sermons from some of the mosques across the country that cited this hadith that basically said, kill a Jew behind every stone, etc. You'll see those videos online. But I think ultimately those need to be addressed. When you talk about the hate and the reform in this era of civil rights that we talked yesterday about celebrating the equality under the law in America, Are we doing that in the Muslim community, or do we continue to blame the other and collectivize? I think that's really what yesterday was all about to me and for me. I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Give me a call at 602-508-0960, 602-508-0960. Let's talk about what Martin Luther King Day meant to you, what it should mean for Muslim reform, what it should mean for modernity, and for our protection of our rights under the law, and how we can use that yesterday's energy to begin to reform the very issues that need treatment in what stimulates and creates radical Islam. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. This is Zuhdi Jasser. The doctor's in the house filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. It's great to be with all of you, and thank you, Seth and Chris, for giving me the chance to share your audience and give you the latest on what's news today and fill you in on things that are funny, well, maybe not so funny, but our mainstream media refuses to cover. And especially in the national security realm, nobody would have ever guessed that there was a revolution brewing in Iran, and probably one of the best anti-nuclear programs that could ever happen, which is the change in Iran from a theocracy. And this revolution is very different from the one in '09. And we'll talk about that in the second hour today. I'll be joined by Ryan Morrow from the Clarion Project, the Shillman Fellow, who's an expert in many of these things. So we'll spend some time with him. And then later in the program, we're going to talk to Shireen Kudosi about that major federal case in Detroit that's due to go to a trial in a few months of a number of physicians who are arrested and going to be on trial for committing the acts of FGM, female genital mutilation. And there's been some changes. One of the charges were dropped, and I'd like us to talk about what's happening there. So give me a call at 602-508-0960, 602-508-0960, and we'll talk about anything that's on your mind, and also the latest in civil rights issues. DACA is on the mind today. We saw the White House talking about that, and immigration. I think you can't separate a discussion of immigration from national security. And I saw the press secretary being fired upon by questions about whether a merit-based system is racist, and it's absurd. How could a system based upon merit not be colorblind unless that's the lens through which they want to see it? I do think that one of the things I wanted to tell you that I'd like to see covered is that the merit, whenever we talk about a merit-based immigration system, that it be based on ideology, that part of the merit is not only what you bring to society, as I heard the White House saying many times today, but the merit of the ideology, that if you're going to come to America, you should share in what it means to be American, what it means to contribute to this society, what it means to share in what the American experiment means, what our constitutional republic's about, that you not believe in a theocratic Islamist state, that you not believe in a Soviet autocratic state of the 20th century, let alone a Russian autocratic one of the 21st century, that you not be a communist from China or from any country that ultimately has ideologies that are incompatible with Western freedom. Let's take a call from Veronica. Veronica, what's on your mind?
Hi, thank you for taking me in. Well, I am very appalled to hear about calling our president racist based on him expressing his opinion, because I believe this is what the basic of our freedom, and American freedom, is to tell the truth, even if it's ugly, rather than saying a nice, sweet lie and getting attention from people who would like to hear just nice things. I don't believe president is racist because it proves by his action. Before he was a president, he actually helped Haiti people. He helped people in South America. It's about what you do. And expressing yourself in a closed group like he did whatever he said, I mean, it's nothing to do with the racism. I am just so surprised that people are in a position of decision makers are in such low level of consciousness that they will call this racist. It has nothing to do with race. America is an amazing country where you can be free to be who you are, and I know this from my own personal experience coming to this country, and I love it so much, and I'm afraid that this will be taken away from us. So please, this is not true what they are saying about President Trump in the media. Also, when it comes to Islamic situation, women, the job of every mother, which should be protecting their children, and Muslim women don't protect their children, cannot protect their children because they are so oppressed. They cannot actually control what's happening to those children. It's just like, I'm appalled. I don't understand how we can even allow Islamists to be in this country the way they are doing it. They had this Sheraton meeting. CARE had a meeting in Sheraton here in town, and we were there and, peacefully protesting about, that this is not compatible with America.
It was, and if I can just jump in quick, and I think you raise a good point there. I will say that, I think as a Muslim, I know the vast majority of Muslim women who want to protect their kids and do. And you're right about the Islamists. I think the Islamists often, it's between them and God what their intent is, and their intent may be to protect their children. But ultimately what happens is they allow them to become oppressed by the tribal consciousness, if you will, that takes away the rights of girls especially to choose whether they date, what they wear, what they put around their head. I mean, the people were demonstrating in Iran. Women were marching in the streets saying that we want our government to care more about what's inside our head than what's around it. And they're talking about the hijab. And it should be a religious choice that people can make on their own, not one the government can force down them. And unfortunately, there's this perception that when people come to the United States, they immediately become Jeffersonian Democrats. And ultimately, obviously, assimilation takes time. It takes critical thinking. It takes tough love with our immigrant communities. And anyone that asks about it or talks about it becomes a racist. Like you said, this meeting here at the Sheraton, we had Linda Sarsour, who was joined by, I think, a virulent homophobe, a preacher who's been known to be quite racist himself. And also we saw the Senate candidate Deidre Aboud speak in there, and yet nobody wanted to cover that. And it was sad to see, so thank you for mentioning that.
Well, yeah, thank you. I don't understand how the Quran itself, the teaching of Quran, it's actually compatible with our way of life. What would it take that we can have reformation, that you guys can have reformation of your religion? Because it's not only religion, it's also totalitarian and imperialistic ideology.
Well, remember, the interpretations is what is often incompatible. The book itself, you can read my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, in which I have chapters that talk about reinterpretation of the Quran. But this is, a religion is what its practitioners practice. So you're right. Most of the 56 Muslim majority countries are dictatorships, theocracies, and don't share our values. I think most Muslims who come here because they want to be able to practice a version of Islam that is compatible with the 21st century. We just have to hold them accountable and recognize that Islamism is the greatest threat to Western security in the 21st century. But we need to stand up for those values and not call it racism and not call it by some type of identity politics. So when we come back, we'll continue the conversation. Join me here, filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. This is Zuhdi Jasser. The doctor is in the house. This is Zuhdi Jasser, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. The doctor is in the house. Thank you for being with me. And a lot to cover as the mainstream media continues to ignore much of what's happening across the planet in their obsession and their Trump derangement syndrome. But, yesterday we had a recognition of a day that recognized a hero in the civil rights movement in the 60s, Martin Luther King Jr. And as a Muslim, I was struck by, one of the terms you hear a lot is this term Islamophobia. I hate that term. I don't even know what it means. And yet, you talk to these Muslim groups, the Islamist groups, and that's what they throw in your face. They don't talk about bigotry against Muslims. They talk about Islamophobia. And I'll tell you why they do that. Because if they really cared about bigotry against Muslims, they would be leading efforts to reform, efforts against counterterrorism, counter-radicalization. They would be telling Americans that we are, and showing Americans that we are the best asset against radical Islam. But no, they prefer the bandana of victimization, that somehow we are threatened more by the rest of America than the global threat of theocracy. And it's sad, you look at the Council on American Islamic Relations, and little of their feed over the past month since the January 2nd revolution in Iran began was about the revolution in Iran, the nascent revolution that may be dying off. And we're going to talk to Ryan Murrow next hour about that. But at the end of the day, I think it's very telling that Islamist groups in America aren't screaming from the rooftops to try to change the regimes that many of them escaped. I think with one exception, I think the Syrian community has finally been doing that over the past few years, but it took, sadly, a horrific revolution for that to happen. But it's sad for me to see the leading Islamist groups not even mention Iran or hardly deal with it. And I think there is no greater sign in which we can show that we care about civil rights than to be calling for the freedom of Iran from its oppressors. There is no greater, I think, protection of American security than to end the theocrats of Iran, and that would be the best anti-nuclear deal, and no longer dealing with the theocrats. And what was different about this revolution was that it wasn't just in Tehran as the Green Revolution was in '09. This one was in the seats of religious leadership. And we'll talk about that next hour. But I do think that if you look at this term, Islamophobia, it's not about, when you talk about hate against Jews, you talk about anti-Semitism. You rarely hear the Jewish community talk about Judeophobia, and there's a reason behind that, because anti-Semitism is against Semites. It's against a people, an identified people. Islamophobia is a term created by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to prevent their own citizens from speaking up against Islam, from reforming the ideas. So they subconsciously teach their people and the world that if you say anything against Islam, it's bigotry. And thus, reform stops dead in its tracks. And you saw that everywhere. In Awad's piece in Care in Time magazine yesterday, you saw him tell us that we should, as American Muslims, apply the importance of coordinated strategies carried out by wide coalitions to change the written, unwritten rules around how an entire community of Americans should and shouldn't be treated. They collectivize us Muslims as a whole group. That's what Islamophobia is. It's about giving rights to an idea. Islam is an idea. And yet, when they're talking about the rights of Muslims who are people, they prefer to give the idea rights because that gives the theocrats the power to define what is and what is not Islam and who is not a Muslim. And I think that's been the problem. And, recently when I heard President Trump talk about tightening up libel laws and other things, I got worried because the first people, ask the Canadians, ask the Germans and the British, who often is exploiting libel laws in those countries. It is the Islamists. They are trying to prevent people from criticizing. Anyone who criticizes. I testified in Canadian Parliament a couple months ago, and I was shouted down by a couple Muslim MPs who basically said that I was anti-Muslim and exhibiting Islamophobia. And that is the whole purpose in which they push legislation about Muslims through there, and they try to silence critics by saying that we are anti-Islam, and Islam is an idea. So stop using the term Islamophobia. Yeah, There are episodes and acts of bigotry against Muslims that we need to prevent, like we would against any community, but we need to recognize that anti-Semitism, hate against various minorities and others exists to the same, if not more, and ultimately the best form of protecting the rights of Muslims is for Americans to see us defending our Constitution and defending what it means to be American. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth and Chris. Call me at 508-0960, 508-0960. We'll talk about what's on your mind, and we'll be right back. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. Bill, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, and it's the doctor's in the house, as we say. A lot to talk about with the mainstream media, who seems to ignore what's happening around the world. And so it's my opportunity to get you all up to date. And yesterday, as we mentioned, was using the occasion of the Martin Luther King holiday to talk about what American Muslims are doing for civil rights within the Muslim community. And the civil rights battle of the 21st century, I believe, is on the front lines within the Muslim communities, not only in Iran and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, but inside the mosques in America. And I think don't underestimate, either way, don't misunderstand the importance of the battles within local mosques, not only here in Arizona, but across the country, that if you look at reform, and somebody sent me a gift of Eric Metaxas's book on Martin Luther, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And I think that if you look, we just celebrated 500 years since the Reformation, the Christian Reformation. And actually, as you may recall, that 500-year mark landed on October 31st, right at the attack, one of the ISIS attacks in New York City. And it may have been a coincidence, it may not. It was one of those synchronicities, if you will, those alignment of things. And I think that if you look in America, where we have the laboratory to question authority, where we have the laboratory for me, for example, to speak out against imams, against certain scripture, like that passage I mentioned earlier that I believe should be expunged from our so-called hadith, which is some of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that have been corrupted over time. And not the Quran, but the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, that much of which is not even legitimate. One of those is repeated often as one of the rallying cries for anti-Semitism. And I think if you look at the Hamas charter, it includes one of those passages that needs to be expunged and is not part of our Quranic scripture. And we have the laboratory to do that here in America. And every occasion, whether it's our Bill of Rights Day, whether it's our Independence Day, Martin Luther King Day, whatever it may be, I think Muslims need to start looking within on what is the legacy that we are going to leave behind. Is it a legacy of victimhood, of whining about Islamophobia? Or is it a legacy of leadership, of reform, of challenging our leaders and changing and forcing out the establishment? The establishment is the problem. And I think that's one of the things I learned from this last campaign is, this last campaign was focused on domestic establishment, but I think in the Muslim consciousness, we have a global establishment problem. And don't ever think that the global establishment of the Islamic leaders in Iran or Saudi Arabia have no impact on what's happening here in America, because when you have American Islamist groups like CARE, which ignore what's happening in Iran and focus on the big problem being their rights as compared to blaming what the rest of America does to them rather than what Muslims do to other Muslims, I think that tells you that they are more influenced by the propaganda from abroad, from Iranian television or press TV, which many of them appear on, or Saudi television of Al Arabiya and other networks that are paid for as state-sponsored media that many of them appear on and ultimately push that propaganda of the Islamist ideology. So I think the reflections I hope we have after yesterday is a reflection on the real civil rights battle for Muslims being on the front lines of fighting misogyny, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting the intolerance of critical thinking that exists, and the need for real reformation. And I think as we talk about immigration, now the United States is going to be under major conversation over the next week or two about how to effectively reform our immigration system. And when we talk about merit-based immigration in America, why am I not hearing a conversation about ideological? Merit should be also about ideological consistency. It should only stand to reason that people who come here because they respect and they want to share with what it means to be American. And that should be part of the merit basis. Somehow always when we talk about merit-based immigration system, after you get past all the noise of calling it racism, which it's not, you have people who forget to talk about the fact that it also should be ideological, that we should not be, inviting people to come in that don't share in the social contract of a secular liberal democracy of our republic. So I think that's an extremely important conversation. So in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk to you also about, before we get into Iran in the next hour, I invited Ryan Morrow, who's going to be joining us to talk about the latest in Iran, the latest in the threat of ISIS domestically and globally. But before we do that, let's talk about Saudi Arabia for a second. I think, we saw, and there was a lot of this palace intrigue in the Game of Thrones that is happening inside Saudi Arabia, but make no mistake, what happened in Saudi Arabia was a coup. The newly anointed future king, King Salman, anointed MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the young, aspiring, now crown prince who will be the king after King Salman steps down. But what we're missing, I think, in the coverage is the fact that this was a coup. Now, ultimately, if you look simply at American interests, we are much better off with what's happening post-coup than we were before, because most of the princes, over 200 princes, were arrested and put in that prison called the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. And as they are hanging out. Now, I will tell you the latest update on this coup is that Prince Walid bin Talal al-Walid was one of the princes that now was taken from the Ritz and actually put in a real prison. And this guy was the wealthiest Saudi, and now he's sitting in a real prison now. We don't know what that cell looks like or what's happening, but the bottom line is that he will not hand over his interest in some of his media arms and some of his other global interests. So this is about money. It's about kleptocracy. It's about control. It's also about a division in Saudi Arabia where the princes that were feeding the Muslim Brotherhood globally, that were working with Qatar, and other regimes that were working with Islamist movements have been reined in, and that was part of the reason that this rift happened. So obviously the Islamists recently declaring America an enemy state, anything that would marginalize them is to our benefit. Now, in the long term, though, a more autocratic, kleptocratic Saudi Arabia is not going to be to our interest. I think that it will ultimately radicalize its population. But in the short term, it headed in a better direction than it was to, if you look at most of the organizations and mosques that have been funded in Europe and the United States, Talal bin al-Walid was one of those that was funding them. And to see his ability to fund organizations that hate us more and more, it's good to see that come to an end. Now, where it will go, this was no Arab Spring, as Friedman called it. It was simply a coup. This is Zuhdi Jasser, filling in for Seth and Chris. Give me a call, 508-0960, 602-508-0960, and we'll be right back. This is Zuhdi Jasser, filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. It is great to be with you. Thank you for listening in. And join the conversation, 602-508-0960. Next hour, I'll be joined by Ryan Morrow from the Clarion Project. We're going to talk about Iran. We're going to talk about the Fuqra files. He'll tell you a little bit about that project of his. And actually, it talks about some Muslim groups that targeted our work. So a lot to talk about. We'll finish this hour basically talking about what is the lens that we should look at what it means to be American, what it means to be an American Muslim. And I think that we need to stop the racialization of Islam, the racialization of Muslims. It's an ideology. And I hope when you talk about immigration, when you talk about national security, you realize that this is a conversation that should be about merit, should be about ideology, and that actually when we feed into collectivizing communities, you actually do the opposite of what Martin Luther King taught. Let's actually take a call from Rick before we end the hour. Rick, welcome. Rick, are you with me?
Yeah. Yes, I got your back, Rudy.
Thanks for being with me.
You're
we only have
heroes.
Thank you. What can I do for you?
Well, in the past, I've been debating with my conservative friends, especially pro-Israel Zionist types who I support, by and large. But I think they're missing a boat here when they say it's the same old, and you sort of echoed it in the long run that maybe it's going to be the same old Islamist radical ideology. But from what I understand, MBS is speaking to an ever younger Saudi population. I believe I heard the number 50% under the age of 25 very soon or now. And maybe, just maybe, those people, the Green Revolution in Iran, we know that Sisi in Egypt is being moderate and kind of allying with Israel against the Shia coming down from the north in a crescent. Is there a possibility, my question, is there a possibility that we have a sea change here and we really don't want to do anything that undermines MBS, not have it bin Salman? That's my question.
Well, that's a great question. And, listen, if he would telegraph and tell us where he's headed, then maybe I could trust him. But bottom line is here's the guy who spent $400 million on a painting that was put in the Middle East Louvre. He also spent $500 million on a home in Paris. So it's almost $1 billion on things that don't show somebody who's really trying to rein in the purse strings in Saudi Arabia. So I think we need to be critical.
But he let women drive in Saudi Arabia.
I know. Well, yeah, I know. So, time's up, as the old saying's talking about, right? About women's rights. Time's up. They've been delaying things and kicking down the road with little morsels of progress here and there. But you're right. It's better than what we had, but we need to push them with some tough love. They're our allies. We buy a lot of oil from them, so it needs to have some strings attached. This is Zuhdi Jasser. We'll be back next hour with Ryan Morrow. We'll talk about more about national security and filling in for Seth and Chris on the Seth and Chris Show. It's always great to be with all of you. We'll be right back.